Greetings, I'm Dr. Doug Campbell, and today we're here to talk about booze. That is to say, hooch, rotgut, firewater, palliative, nippetatty, oh be joyful, the water of life. You know, alcoholic drink. The names for it are as various as its forms, and intoxicating tipples have been consumed by almost all human societies throughout the millennia. And fair enough, I suppose it's hardly groundbreaking to note that we as a species like to get our collective drink on, sometimes to excess. But is that really worth the attention of serious students of history? Shouldn't we be talking about, I don't know, wars and emperors and constitutions and stuff like that? Well, what if I told you that the history of booze is just as important as all of that other stuff? That alcohol has often stood at the nexus between economics, social class, political power, religion, and that its uses and abuses reveal something fairly significant about what it means to be human. Would you believe me? Or would you think I've just had a bit too much to drink? Or to put it another way, is the history of booze B.S.? That's what we're here to talk about. Cheers.
What'll it be?
I'm awfully glad you asked me that, Lloyd, because I just happen to have 2 20s and 2 10s right here in my wallet. I was afraid they were going to be there till next April. So here's what. You slip me a bottle of bourbon, a little glass, and some ice. You can do that, can't you, Lloyd? You're not too busy, are you?
No, sir. I'm not busy at all.
So from the get-go, let us be clear about what this video is not supposed to be, which is any sort of encouragement for people to drink alcohol. Well, booze certainly does have its pleasant traits as a bringer of pleasant flavors and sensations, as a social lubricant that encourages self-expression and can sometimes make tedious conversation just a bit more interesting. We should be clear that there are a lot of downsides as well. Historically, the consumption of alcohol has been associated not merely with excessive, dare we say, embarrassing levels of exuberance, but also with bad decision-making, with abuse, with violence. Let's also not forget that alcohol is indeed a poison, which needs to be processed by the liver. Excessive consumption of alcoholic beverages is associated with a wide array of chronic health conditions that can lead to an early grave for the overly enthusiastic imbiber.
You thought we enjoyed this stuff.
I thought this stuff was supposed to make you feel better.
No, it's supposed to make you feel nothing.
This stuff obviously has a dark side.
To alcohol, the cause of and solution to all of life's problems.
That said, our species can be pretty dark from time to time, so is it really surprising that booze reveals our bad traits as well as our good ones? From the get-go, though, let us note that this is more than just a human story. For there would be no booze without the symbiotic relationship we have with a humble fungus, yeast. As a naturally occurring microorganism, yeast loves to eat sugars produced by fruits and grain. As the yeast processes these sugars with enzymes, it produces carbon dioxide and ethanol as byproducts. The CO2 is what makes bread rise and gives beer bubbles, but it's the ethanol that gets you plastered. So indeed, when you get drunk, you sort of get drunk off of yeast poo. We don't know the exact circumstances under which the first alcoholic drink was consumed, but it's not hard to imagine yeast going to town on the malt sugars produced by some rain-moistened barley, and then the resulting boozy gruel, the first beer, being consumed by one of the more adventurous-minded of our Neolithic forebears, who enjoyed the pleasant sensations that ensued. There are indications that people were producing beer intentionally as far back as the settlement at Göbekli Tepe in Neolithic Asia Minor circa 8500 BC. That's one of the very first human agricultural settlements that we know of. We know for certain that beer was a staple of life in ancient Sumeria, which is often termed the first human civilization. Among the remnants of this ancient society, we have a Hemteninkasi, the goddess of brewing, which dates to 1800 BC and which was accompanied by a recipe for making beer. Again, it was more of a pulpy, intoxicating porridge than it was kind of the crisp, clear amber brew that we know and love in the modern era.
Deutsches Bier. Claro. Ja, ist Bitburger. Schmeckt gut, ne? Das Beste.
Take another sip. But it got the job done. Beer and bread was apparently a common greeting in ancient Sumeria and in a lot of the Mesopotamian cultures that succeeded it, testifying to the importance of both grain and yeast in this ancient civilization. Most tellingly is a passage from the Epic of Gilgamesh, often termed the oldest work of human literature, which describes how the beast man named Enkidu became human. In the account, it was because a prostitute gave him bread and beer. This is from Tablet 2 of the Akkadian version of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Enkidu knew nothing about eating bread for food, and of drinking beer he had not been taught. The harlot spoke to Enkidu, saying, "Eat the food, Enkidu, it is the way one lives. Drink the beer as is the custom of the land." Enkidu ate the food until he was sated. He drank the beer, 7 jugs, and became expansive and sang with joy. He was elated and his face glowed. He splashed his shaggy body with water and rubbed himself with oil and turned into a human. So there you have it. According to the ancient Mesopotamians, part of what it made a civilized human being, in addition to associating with sex workers, was not just bread, but also beer. It was the beverage of the common person. It was associated and sanctioned by the gods. It was an integral part of daily life in this ancient society and part and parcel of being a civilized human. Wine, on the other hand, which, if beer is fermented grain, wine is fermented fruit of various types, usually grapes.
Try the wine. Thank you, sir. Cheers. Happy days.
It seems to have been associated with social elites in the ancient world, in part because of its rarity. You know, the grains, they grow more or less everywhere. Grapes, on the other hand, are much more temperamental, only flourish in select places and climates. So the upper classes of the ancient Middle East prized wine as a more sophisticated beverage for superior people. The first wine we have evidence for seems to have originated in the Zagros Mountains in northern Persia and Armenia, but eventually it spread northward and westward to Europe, eastward to Asia. Among the ancients, for the Greeks, wine assumed an extremely important place in their culture. When drinking it, they tended to dilute it with water. Those who drank strong, undiluted wine, like barbarians, which is to say, anybody who was not Greek, were not in control of their passions.
For the real action is.
Those, on the other hand, who abstained totally from wine were regarded as little more than children, rather than fully cultivated and civilized adults.
I never drink. Why? Well,
in classical Greek society, the symposium emerged as a venue which combined philosophical discussion with the drinking of wine. Men, and only men, we should be clear, women needed not apply.
Women Can't live with them, can't live without them.
Words of wisdom, Lloyd. Words of wisdom.
This was dudes only, a total sausage fest. In fact, they met in a room called an andron, sort of means the man's room, if you will. They met to have a meal, to discuss, to bandy about wittily, and to drink wine late into the night. Some of the more famous descriptions of Greek symposia involve the OG of Greek philosophy, a dude named Socrates, who you've probably heard of, as an eager participant in these discussions, although he is often described as imbibing only moderately, keeping his intellect keen and unimpaired, even as his companions got soused.
Because I got to hold on to my angst. I preserve it because I need it. It keeps me sharp, on the edge, where I got to be.
Let's point to this particular passage from the philosopher Xenophon's description of the symposium, describing Socrates' attitude toward wine. So far as drinking is concerned, you have my hearty approval. For wine does of a truth moisten the soul, and lull our griefs to sleep, at the same time awakening kindly feelings as oil quickens a flame. However, if we pour ourselves immense draughts, it will be no long time before both our bodies and minds reel, and we shall not be even able to draw breath, much less to speak sensibly. But if the servants frequently besprinkle us with small cups, we shall thus not be driven by the wine to a state of intoxication, but instead shall be brought by its gentle persuasion to a more sportive mood. So there you have it from Socrates. Drink, but not too much. The Romans had a similar institution called the convivium, which, at least with this, women were allowed to attend.
I don't care whose wife she is. I don't like a dame that gets noisy after she's had a few snifters.
Both Romans and Greeks produced wine of various grades, with the lowest quality vintages often adulterated with various other flavorings to mask the bitterness, reserved for poorer people and servants, while the best, most flavorful wines were set aside for, you guessed it, the wealthy and the powerful. So, the consumption of alcohol in the ancient Mediterranean world reveals something about the relationship between the various social classes. The major religions in this region during late antiquity had varying stances regarding the consumption of intoxicating beverages. Certainly in the Christian Gospels, Jesus is portrayed as comparing himself to the fruitful vines used by winemakers. And one of the most symbolically resonant miracles attributed to him is the changing of water into wine at the wedding at Cana. Moreover, the account of the Last Supper of Jesus before his execution finds him instructing his disciples to take a cup of wine and, quote from the Gospel of Matthew, "Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." This obviously became the basis for the Christian sacrament of the Eucharist. Clearly, wine had a great deal of symbolic significance for early Christians. Islam, on the other hand, tended to prohibit intoxicating beverages, with at least one verse in the Quran condemning wine alongside gambling, divination, and other vices. Nevertheless, however, booze continued to be consumed at times by Muslims throughout history. We might point, for example, to Abu Nawas, one of the greatest Arabic language poets of the Abbasid Golden Age, and a frequent companion of Harun al-Rashid, one of the greatest Abbasid caliphs. Abu Nawas, in verse, celebrated both the drinking of wine and sexual encounters with young men. Perhaps not the most pious of Muslims, but certainly a literary genius and an enthusiastic drinker nonetheless. Indeed, despite the general stance against alcoholic drinks, it was the medieval Islamic world and its tremendously talented scientists who took the next step in boozy evolution by refining the process of distillation. Now, certainly there are some indications that distillation occurred as far back as ancient Greece, but it was the medieval Islamic world that perfected the process. Indeed, both alembic, a tool used in the distillation process, and the term alcohol itself are Arabic words. So when we're talking about distillation, what we mean is that since alcohol boils at a lower temperature than water, heating an alcoholic beverage produces a boozy vapor, which then condenses into a more intensely alcoholic liquid as it is captured and cools in another vessel. These techniques were, however, picked up by the Christian world, which was a bit more receptive to such exhilarating tipples. So ultimately in the Christian lands, there wasn't much distinction seen between alchemy, medicine, intoxicating beverages, and the new boozes, which were indeed often produced in monasteries, were seen as beneficial to the health, were even seen as potentially being helpful in warding off lethal maladies such as the Black Death. That didn't actually work, but it probably made people feel a little bit better about their anxieties to be a little tipsy. During the Middle Ages, whether we're talking about distilled grain liquors, such as the so-called aquavitae, Latin for water of life, which in Gaelic became whiskey, which from that we get in English whiskey. The water of life. The water of life. Or distilled wines. The Dutch called it brandewijn, burned wine, which becomes the English brandy. Like all of this stuff, the new higher proof drinks proliferated throughout Europe. Some of these liquors saw the addition of herbs and other botanicals to produce strongly flavored drinks. That's where we get stuff like gin or absinthe.
Absence is the aphrodisiac of the cell. The green fairy who lives in the absence wants your soul.
Among the distilled liquors that we definitely have to talk about, though, is one that was produced by substances not produced in Europe at all, but were tied into European conquests across the Atlantic Ocean. This variant was distilled from fermented sugarcane, or more often molasses, which was a byproduct of sugar production. Originally it was called Kill Devil or Rum Bullion, but eventually this liquor was simply termed rum. And obviously, this is tied to the history of Europe's desire for sugar, its use of slave labor, first in the Atlantic islands, then in the Caribbean and Brazil, to produce it. Rum represented a sugar product which did not spoil and which was comparatively easy to transport. Eventually, it became a major commodity in its own right, which was widely traded all over the Caribbean, to the Americas, and back to Europe. And let us be clear, none of this could have existed without the widespread use of the labor of slaves kidnapped from Africa and forced to labor in nightmarish conditions of brutality to produce the sugarcane and the booze that the Europeans so craved.
Good man. You set him up and I'll knock him back, Lloyd. One by one. White man's burden, Lloyd, my man. White man's burden.
Sugar and rum production played a significant role in a couple of major 18th century revolutions. One was obviously the slave revolt in the 1790s in Haiti, which had been a major center of sugar and rum production. This was one of the great events of modern world history, the most prominent successful slave revolt in the history of the entire world. We could also point to the importation of rum, as well as molasses to make rum, which was a significant part of the economy of Britain's North American colonies during the 1700s. It was the British government's imposition of taxes on rum, molasses, and other commodities to help defray the costs of defending its North American colonies that prompted the rebellion that we came to know as the American Revolution. Once the United States succeeded in severing political ties with Britain, however, the Brits retaliated by ceasing rum and molasses imports to North America from its Caribbean colonies, prompting America to shift to whiskey production rather than rum, which was much easier to make using locally available grains. There is a certain rich irony, I suppose, to the fact that the new American government's efforts to raise revenue saw it impose tariffs on domestic whiskey production, resulting in the so-called Whiskey Rebellion of 1791, which ultimately had to be militarily suppressed by one President George Washington, who himself had a distillery on his Mount Vernon estate. So, perhaps you can make an argument that there's no American Revolution without booze and booze-related issues. We could go on and on. We haven't mentioned some of the other fermented beverages produced by various societies. Mead from fermented honey, palm wine, sake, which is produced from fermented rice, pulque in the Americas, which is produced from fermented agave. But we don't want this video to be an hour. In terms of recommended readings, we've talked about the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Greek philosopher Xenophon's Symposium. For secondary sources, let us reference Tom Standage's 2005 book, A History of the World in 6 Glasses, as well as Adam Rogers' 2015 Proof, The Science of Booze. And one more thing, since I happen to be recording this video on January the 25th, which is Burns Night, to commemorate the birthday of the immortal Scottish poet Robert Burns. Let us read from his 1785 poem, Scotch Drink. O thou my muse, good old Scotch drink, whether through wimpling worms thou jink, or richly brown rear o'er the brink, in glorious fame inspire me, till I lisp and wink, to sing thy name. So is the History of Booze B.S.? Far from it. Intoxicating beverages have been pretty intimately intertwined with human society, and to study our relationship with booze, the good and the bad, reveals a great deal of what it means to be human. So to that I say, sláinte. That's all I have for you. Always remember to check your sources and evidence, and drink in moderation. See ya.
You want a drink?
What do you think?